All right, so we are officially leaving the world of plants, at least for right now. Like I said, we'll rejoin it at the very end of the semester when we kind of talk about how everything's related. We'll hopefully have a few lectures on that at the end of the semester. But right now, we are still in that biodiversity. So, like, what all exists when we talk about life? That's what we're talking about right now, and we are entering into the best part, the invertebrates. Some would argue this isn't the best part. They're just wrong. Inverts are the coolest. It's a fact. Scientific fact, I'm sure. Not biased at all. So when I talk about inverts, we are finally entering into the kingdom Animalia. I know that we've gone over this many times, and y'all are all like, girl, this is old hat by now, but this will be probably the last time I tell you. So one last reminder, there are 3 domains when we talk about the phylogeny of life. We have archaea. Those are the weirdos. They don't really fit anywhere else. They are extremophiles. They live in crazy places. Then we have bacteria, the other prokaryotes that just are kind of more normal. They don't have those weird proteins and modifications that allow them to live in strange places. They're a little more recent when we talk about an evolutionary time scale. And then, of course, we have the domain eukarya, which includes all of our eukaryotic organisms. We talked about protista. That was, again, another little catch-all, like, it's eukaryote, so we're putting in protists. We have fungi, which are decomposers. There are some that are microbes, but a lot of them are also macroscopic, mushrooms and stuff. Then we have your plants. They have those lovely cell walls, go through photosynthesis. And now, finally, we are in Animalia. So we're going to talk about all of the animals. And we're going to start here with the inverts because they're the coolest. And also, we will be spending a good chunk of time on humans. And they're not inverts, they're verts. So when we talk about the crazy diversity of invertebrates, we're going to talk about phyla. So remember, when we talk about phylogeny and how it's grouped, you have domain is the biggest, then kingdom, phylum. Did King Philip come? Okay, sorry. I told you there's all sorts of mnemonics. I have to use it every time. Class, order, family, genus, and species. I always get order and family and class, or really it's like class and order. I always mess that one up. So we talked about the 3 domains. We talked about the kingdom. We are officially in kingdom Animalia. So now we're going to talk about phylum. So an invertebrate is just something without a backbone. That's it. It's just like a fancy way of saying it. In, that prefix usually means not. And so we have invertebrate, means no vertebrae, no backbone. Every animal that has a backbone lives in the phylum Chordata, stands for chordate. Everything else is its own phylum. And you might be like, okay, great, amazing. It is amazing because when we're talking about, how all of this life is organized, we're all the way up here. We're on these highest level of organization. And there are tons of phyla of inverts. Inverts really are so diverse, much more so than vertebrates. And that's because they don't have a backbone. They don't have any bones, in fact. So their body shapes can take a lot more different shapes. And their bodies do all sorts of crazy, incredible things that once you have bones, you're just so much more limited. It's kind of like they're unlimited. They can do whatever they want. And because of that, their biodiversity is so much more extreme. Now, remember, biodiversity is the number of species. And the biodiversity of inverts versus verts is ridiculous. Over 95% of all animals are invertebrates. I'm going to repeat that because it does bear repeating. Over 95% of all animals are invertebrates. So there's a little bit of verts and a ton of inverts. And this is by species, not by actual biomass. If we get into biomass, wowzers, there's a heck of a lot more. Ants, yeah, little bitty ants, well outweigh humans. Yeah. And what I mean is by like all of the ants. Like you're like, ma'am, excuse me, I'm so sorry. I weigh more than an ant. You do. But if you were to keep all of the ants on Earth and all of the humans on Earth and you put us on this huge scale, ants win. They're heavier. Yeah. So we talk about biomass, this would be even more extreme. But we're not talking about biomass, we're talking about number of species. So inverts really take the cake. And remember from that last lecture when I told you all about kind of the overall biodiversity of plants, there are a heck of a lot more species of animals identified than there are plants or anything else. So this is the most biodiverse as far as number of species, which is the definition of biodiversity. And it's really, really dominated by inverts. So inverts kind of take it over. So that's amazing. We're going to talk about just some kind of general things about inverts first, and then we're going to get into phyla. This, because there's so many invertebrates, is going to take us 2 lectures. So I've kind of organized this lecture, and then I've come to what I think is a pretty decent stopping point. We're at the worms, and then we're going to go on to the next ones. Today's got some cool ones. The next lecture on inverts has some of the cooler ones, in my opinion. But today has some beautiful, incredible creatures that we can talk about. And hopefully I just this is really, these next 2 lectures, they are to help you, understand inverts, why they're important, how they kind of impact your daily life. That's all true. But really, you can kind of think about this as like a love letter from me to invertebrates because they're incredible. Absolutely incredible. And need to be appreciated because of their incredibleness. I think that's a word. It's going to be now. So first one, we talk about symmetry. How are organisms organized? Really, this is like if we were going to cut them in half or cut them in certain ways, how would they always be the same? So first, here shown in A, you have what's called asymmetrical, which means no matter how you cut it, it's never going to be the same on either side. So it's kind of like there's no pattern here. It's just like, wow, a bunch of party parts everywhere. And then you have radial symmetry. And this is kind of something that is like a wheel. So if you cut it like a wheel on different, and you make these different like pizza slices, so like like a pizza. And so here you can cut it into 10 pieces of pizza. Each of these pieces is the exact same, but it all radiates out from a circular pattern. So this is the same as this, is the same as this, is the same as this. You could also cut this pizza into 5 pieces, and that would also be the same, but 10 is more exact. So pretty much if their symmetry exists in a circle, that's radial symmetry. Then you have bilateral symmetry. And that is when if you can cut it in half, it's the same on both sides. And then you have, this comes by different names, to be honest, but usually it's called pseudo bilateral. Occasionally it's called externally bilateral. There's a couple of different names. And pretty much this is where humans are, and here on D, because from the outside, obviously, yes, you could have like a defect in something, but for the most part, people look the same on either side. If you were to cut you in half, like from head, cut you all the way down in between your crotch, you're like, hey, here I am, 2 different Beckys. It would be the same externally, but internally you wouldn't be. Your liver has 5 lobes and they're not exactly equal on both sides. Your heart is not right here in the middle, it's a little bit to the left. So if you were to cut yourself in half, then only one half would have a heart. That'd be pretty unfortunate for the other half. You only have a gallbladder on one side, and appendix only goes on one side, things like that. So we're pretty much bilaterally symmetrical, but some of our organs are a little bit off kilter, so we're not technically. So this D is kind of like bilateral symmetry, little subset. Some books don't even include D, but I just thought it was worth mentioning. Now, inverts, you see it all. You see asymmetrical, radially symmetrical, and bilaterally symmetrical. For vertebrates, they're all either C or D. but let's just call, all under that umbrella of bilateral symmetry. There are no radially symmetrical vertebrates, and there's certainly no asymmetrical vertebrates. Again, once you have bones, you're really, really constricted. You can't just kind of do whatever you want. But with invertebrates, that freedom from bones really allows their bodies to take all sorts of crazy forms. And we're going to see that today and continue to see that in the next lecture when we continue our love letter. I say it's from me, but it can be from all of us to invertebrates. So symmetry is really important because that's how the organism is completely organized. Now, another thing when we talk about invertebrates is, are they sessile or motile? So this is just kind of how they live their life. Sessile, sorry, I spelled that wrong, means they don't move. Things like coral, which some people think are rocks. They're not rocks. They're living creatures, are sessile. As adults, they do not move at all. Now, and really, unless they're eggs or larvae, they don't move. There are lots and lots and lots of inverts that are sessile for their whole lives, or they might be sessile for part of their lives. It just depends. And then you also have motile, which means they move. I know, crazy here. So this butterfly flies. It doesn't just like land. It doesn't just like live on a leaf forever. Plants are considered sessile. They're not moving around. Even our carnivorous plants, like our Venus flytrap, while the mouth part will move, it's not going to like get up and run around and chase a fly. So it's still considered sessile. But there are lots of animals that are also considered sessile. Like I said, some of them are for their entire life and some of them are just for part of their life form, which is pretty dang cool. To think about an organism living its whole life without ever moving and not being a plant, being an animal. So then another thing that happens with inverts that you see is this phenomenon called cephalization. I know, another excellent Scrabble word. That just means, does it have a defined head? So this sea urchin right here, beautiful, love it. If I was to say point to its head, you'd be like, oh, no, what's a head? And this can be both externally and it's really important to talk about sensory appendages. So this crayfish over here has a defined head. If I said point to the crayfish's head, you'd be like right here. And what's really interesting about a head, and you can think about this with yourself, is a lot of the sensory organs are in the same spot. So for you, your eyeballs, which is your sense of sight, your tongue, your sense of taste, your nose, your sense of smell, and your ears, your sense of hearing, are all located in the same location, like small part of body. The rest of you can have feeling in some of your trigeminal senses, but most of them are in the same spot, and that's your head, and that's what cephalization is you're kind of moving that. Same with crayfish. Crayfish have cute little mouths under here, though crayfish actually have 12 different parts of their body that kind of allow them to taste. They have little like taste receptors on their legs, which is really cool. But arguably irrelevant right now, but just in case you needed like a little precursor to why crayfish are so cool. Then you have their eyes, which they can see. They have two different these big antennae right here, and then they have small little mini ones, both of which help with smell, which crayfish, because they live at the bottom of water bodies, rely more on smell than they do sight. So having a really good sense of smell, really important. So yeah, again, a lot of their sensory organs are right here on the very top. Now they don't have a cephalized brain, interestingly. Vertebrates do, all of their brain is usually in their head. They don't actually have a brain. They have different clumps of neurons throughout their body, which is also really cool. Something that you see in inverts. So this cephalization happens for some inverts, but not all. And you'll see that pretty easily as we go throughout. You'll see some of them being like, that's a head. And other ones you'll be like, I don't see a head. And that's fine. Inverts can do that. Again, vertebrates not so much. Pretty much every vertebrate has a head. And not just their sensory organs, but their brain is also right there. Again, bones limit you. No bones, you're free. So some have heads, some do not. And having a head is that cephalization. And then when you talk about their body systems, This is really cool. So some have an open circulatory system and some have a closed. And you're gonna be like, I don't know what that means. Okay, so your circulatory system, the whole job of it is to move oxygen throughout the body. This is what our blood is for. That's why you have blood. It moves some other nutrients and things like that, but mainly it's oxygen. It also includes your heart, which is really just the pump that does the moving. So an open, that wasn't English. An open circulatory system, you have oxygen coming into the heart, then it leaves through some kind of blood. Inverts don't have blood. It's usually hemolymph, but it could be some other things. Same general principle, just technically different names because of the components that make up blood versus hemolymph versus, again, there's some other names too. So oxygen enters into the heart and then it goes through the body and leaves the body. And so you can see it kind of goes here and then it doesn't ever go back to the heart. That's open. Then you have closed, where your fluid, again, blood or whatever, goes from the heart, goes into the body, then comes back to the heart without any oxygen. This is what humans have. Your heart pumps out its blood, it goes all throughout the body, gives its oxygen away, comes back to the heart, and is like, man, I got no oxygen. The heart says, all right, no problem, go to the lungs, gets to the lungs, gets to the oxygen, goes back to the heart. The heart's like, you got your oxygen? And the blood's like, yeah, girl, I got it. And then it goes to the rest of the body. We have a whole lecture, or maybe it's just part of a lecture, I'm not sure. But we're going to talk about the human circulatory system in detail later in the semester. But we have closed and they're also open. In some ways, each have their own pros and cons. When you have a closed circulatory system, you don't have to keep making that fluid over and over and over again. But you also don't have to worry about like fixing that fluid and oxygenating it. Whereas with an open circulatory system, you keep making the fluid, but then you can just be done with it. You're like, okay, I'm done. I don't need it anymore. Pretty cool. So you'll see both in inverts because, again, inverts are the coolest, and both in their form, so their external anatomy and their internal anatomy, they can do it all. And then finally, hermaphrodites. They're common. Not all inverts have hermaphrodites, but they're pretty common. So what do I mean by hermaphrodites? This isn't the scientific term. I know that this term has been used sometimes for like hate speech for humans and stuff. No, this is the scientific term for hermaphrodite. And what that really means is it is an organism that has both male and female reproductive organs. What you are looking at right here is some sweet, sweet snail loving. Yes, they have these appendages. They're technically not penises, but they look like penises. And a lot of times people call them that, but that's not technically the name. And yes, snails do have sex in their face. So this is, two land snails, and they're like, hey, let's make a baby. Now, each of these snails has male and female parts. So what's happening here is an exchange of gametes with this, like I said, it's not technically a penis, but a lot of people call it that. Depending on the snail, it has a different name. It is actually leaving one snail and entering into the face of the other snail, and so it can put semen or sperm into the snail. Also happening here. This is great because you don't, like, every time you meet an organism of the same species, it's like, oh my gosh, we can make babies. You don't have to find the right sex. It's like, you're the same species, that's all I need. It works. Really, really cool. Evolutionarily speaking, it's a lot easier. But it's still sexual reproduction, so you still get new genetic information. Amazing. You get to have babies that aren't just clones, because remember, when you do things like budding or binary fission, it's just a clone. There's no new genetic information. But you don't have to like put as much work in. You still got to find something of the same species. Once you do, you're like, great. I'll give you some of mine. You give me some of yours. We'll both make babies. Sound good? And so hermaphrodites in the invertebrate kingdom are pretty common because of all of the things that you said. There are some, what do you call it? Inverts that have males and females, and we'll talk about those. And we'll also talk about hermaphrodites as we go throughout. It just depends on the phylum, and sometimes it's a little more complicated. But yeah, it is really cool to note that hermaphroditism Hermaphroditism is pretty common in inverts. So again, when we think about the way the world works, we're so biased to how humans work. But it's not really the most accurate because so many other organisms thrive and live and evolve and change and survive much better than humans, and live in so many different ways. It's really cool. So that's kind of some general overviews about inverts and some terminology I'll probably be utilizing throughout this and the next lecture, and maybe even other times as well. So I wanted to kind of set the groundwork, and now we're going to start talking about some phyla. First phylum is Porifera. These are sponges. Now, not loofahs. This is important. If you have a loofah, not like the little plasticky ones you can get at Walmart. I have one that has Jasmine's face on it. It's really cute. But like the more natural loofahs, those are actually a plant. But sponges are animals. Now, we do make sponges in a lab with some plastic and some, like, gobbledygook, but there are sponges that are animals, and they are found in freshwater and saltwater. And yeah, they do something really cool, and it is called filter feeding. Oops. Filter. These are some sessile organisms. Remember, that means they do not move. And so you might be like, okay, well, if they don't move, how do they eat? Because they do eat. These are all animals, meaning they all have to eat to survive. These are all heterotrophs. No autotrophs here. So you might be like, okay, can you imagine being a sponge? How do you eat? No problemo. What they do is water comes through all of those holes, those porous holes that make up a sponge. And with it, there is what we call particulate organic matter, or POM for short. Yeah, you really want to like be on a date and you're like, I gotta impress this person. I really want them to know I'm smart. Talk about some particulate organic matter. It's how I got my husband. Not really, but I imagine it could have helped. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure how I got him, but it worked. But particulate organic matter definitely would have helped for sure. I have no doubt about that. So what that is it's living, or it was once living, carbon-based life form, remember? And some of it's living still, some of it's just like bits of dead things just floating in the ocean. The ocean's full of it, particulate organic matter. It's everywhere. And so as the water moves, because the ocean water is always moving, it goes through the sponge, and the sponge picks out the particulate organic matter, and it's like, oh, gosh, delicious, and digests it and eats it. Yep. You heard me. It eats it without having to move, but just relying on the natural movement of the water and the holes in its anatomy. Now, because of this, or kind of, maybe not because of, but something that's also kind of aids in this is that sponges are asymmetrical. So even these that like kind of look circular, because of all these different external projections out here, they're not really perfect. So they have all sorts of crazy growths and stuff, meaning they are asymmetrical, which is really, really uncommon. It's the least common form of symmetry in the animal kingdom. But it allows for kind of all sorts of weird shapes, which help with filter feeding. So sponges are animals, and they filter feed. They reproduce through budding, usually, which is asexual reproduction. However, they also can make gametes, and they're hermaphrodites. Which means that they make both male and female gametes. Sponges and a lot of other things do, because you might be like, oh my gosh, how do they do that? Because they're sessile, they can't move. They do something called broadcast spawning. Really what that means is that they synchronize cross individuals. How they do it, we still don't know, which is really cool. We're working on it. We think it's some sort of trigger from the environment, but however they do it, they're like, okay, today is the day, let's go. And they all release their gametes. So egg and sperm into the water. Those gametes find each other, fertilize, and they make new baby sponges. Some of the sponges are close, some of them are far because they move with the movement of the water. Just like we kind of talked about with spores with fungi. So again, what the thing about this though is when you broadcast spawn, a lot of times you're like, okay, we all need to do it at the same time. Because if you're broadcast spawning and then you're going to do it like 3 days later, then your gametes are never going to find each other. So that's why they kind of synchronize, but exactly how, we don't know. So they can do both, which is pretty cool. And you can actually get live sponges. A lot of the sponges you can buy for your like bath time are actually live animals. Well, they're not anymore. When you have them, they're dead. But they were at one point live animals. So I imagine if you're vegan, you should not use sponges. But they're pretty cool. They do a lot of different things. And even though they kind of just seem like they wouldn't even be an animal, they are. Then you have the phylum Ctenophora. So yes, you don't pronounce this C. Some of you may have noticed, because I get questions about a lot, I have a sticker on my laptop that says I love ctenophores. Yes, it's about this phylum because they're really cool. Also, I met a guy at a conference, and he was really cool, and he studied ctenophores, and he gave me and my best friend swag because he was really cool, and at his poster he had swag. He studied how ctenophores are related through genetic studies, which, it's not what I do. I wouldn't want to look at genes, but other people do, and I enjoyed listening to him talk about it. So ctenophores are what we call comb jellies. You might be like, I know what a jelly is, a jellyfish. Yes and no. So these are related to jellyfish, but you see they have no tentacles. And more importantly, these little friends, you see the G cannot sting you. So this is a jellyfish sting. If you've ever been in the ocean, maybe you've had one, they're absolutely gnarly. Some species of jellyfish, like the Portuguese man of war and box jellyfish, can actually kill you. That's right, kill you. They stop your heart because of the venom, which we'll talk about in a second. But ctenophores, no ma'am, absolutely not, will not kill you. Well, not only won't kill you, can't sting you. They don't have the ability to, which is really interesting. So not all jellyfish can sting you. Comb jellies, in fact, cannot, and they are in the phylum Ctenophore. But there's this other phylum called Cnidaria. Again, the C is silent. These little guys can sting. This phylum includes jellyfish, not comb jellies, but just jellyfish. This is oh, it's not a moon jelly. I thought it was a moon jelly. This is just a really pretty jellyfish. This is a sea anemone, which do sting, if you've ever seen, again, Finding Nemo. I feel like I talk about Finding Nemo a lot. But it's relevant and it's a very good movie. So these sea anemones also have stinging cells, but they have this really cool symbiotic relationship with clownfish, so that they don't sting the clownfish. Clownfish can live there, and the clownfish protect the anemone by eating other things that try to attack it. So it's great on both sides. And coral. Yes, coral. They look like rocks. They're absolutely not. They're actually millions of individual little friends. Kind of like this sea anemone, but just much, much smaller. And they build on top of each other. And they all live as this colony. So they're another one of those colonial organisms. This is one type of coral called brain coral. You bet you can figure that out. These are two over here are two different species of other coral as well. But jellyfish, sea anemones, coral, they are all cnidarians. They are also all filter feed, just like those sponges we talked about previously. So, really cool. They get this name cnidarian for this really cool adaptation they have, these cells called cnidocytes. Now, how this exactly works, there's a lot of names here. We can ignore the names, as always. Not as always, but as we do frequently. But what they are, these are these little cells, and they can get triggered. So if you touch this little, I don't know, it looks like a spine, but it's not. It'll trigger it, and there's like, almost like a spring. It's not exactly a spring, but almost like a spring in here. And it's like spring loaded, kind of like a cap gun. So you pull the trigger and it shoots out. And what it shoots out are these huge barbs, both big and small. And it shoots it out and shoots it into the skin of whatever triggered it. So if it's your hand that triggered it, you're gonna get the barbs in it. Now, a lot of these barbs, besides just like you can imagine having a barb jammed into your skin really hard, hurts really badly, they also can deliver poison. And so those that kill you, they have poison in them. And that poison can overload your heart and your heart stops beating and you die. Yeah, crazy. Now, if you've ever been stung by a jellyfish, you'll notice that you usually get lots of little bitty welts, not just like, or like sometimes they can be so bad it looks like one string because you're so swollen from it. Each of those welts relate to a different cnidocyte. So like along the tentacles of a jellyfish, there's hundreds of cnidocytes, not just one. It's not like one at the end. Also, because of the way this works, because it relies on this trigger spring mechanism, even if a jellyfish is dead, it can still sting you because of this. It can still launch those barbs out. They're also not like, have you ever heard that bees, they can only sting you once. Once they sting you, they die? Partially true depending on the species. Jellyfish aren't like that. They can keep on stinging. And it hurts really bad. It stings and it's very painful. And this is how it all works. And like I said, it's not just jellyfish. Corals can sting you. Most of them, the sting is so minor that you don't even feel it. It doesn't really affect you. And other ones, and so can sea anemones. And like I said, they all filter feed. The other thing that's really cool about cnidarians, and this is only some species, is when we talk about jellyfish, do you know that they actually have a sessile life form? Yes, they do. So when we think about jellyfish, we think about the free-living form, what's called the medusa. There's a beautiful little jelly. I believe that's a lion's mane jelly, but I'm not positive. And so, but they actually spend part of their life as this polyp. And this polyp is attached to the ground. It's sessile. It does not move. So you have your zygote, which is the result of a fertilization of egg and sperm. It becomes this larvae, settles to the ground, forms a polyp. Polyp buds, cuts it off, becomes this, which eventually becomes the medusa. The medusa then creates the gametes and so on and so forth. So yeah, jellyfish have a sessile life form. Really, really cool. And you might be like, okay, well, besides this being a fun fact, like, so when we think about things like butterflies, we think about their cool metamorphosis from a caterpillar to a beautiful butterfly. And that is true. And it is beautiful and really cool. But I just wanted to show you here, and we'll talk about it more when we talk about other insects. That's really common in inverts, is to completely change their entire body. If you saw this little polyp here, would you ever imagine that's a jellyfish? I imagine no, unless you just have a great imagination. So again, kind of the theme of the day is that when you don't have bones, you're not restricted. You can kind of do and become anything you want, which is amazing. And why inverts are so cool and why they're the coolest. So that's cnidaria, amazing little creatures. Then you have bryozoan. These are super, super old, meaning they evolved a very, very long time ago, haven't changed a ton since. And these kind of look like coral, but they're technically not. They don't have those cnidocytes. And they're not multiple organisms. These are just one organism, I believe. But they're like little bitty, and they're tiny, and they also encrust on rocks and things. So they can live. So like each of these little things is different bryozoan. They're just kind of cool, and they're small, and they are a phylum of inverts, which is why we're talking about them today. Then you have these really, really cool things called horseshoe worms. Yes. Phylum Phaeronidae. So these are worms, some of which are sessile, as you can see here, some of which are not. This is more of a worm. It does move around. They all have these crazy bristles all over their bodies. What do these bristles do? They help with filter feeding. Because yes, these are filter feeding worms. They're beautiful. they do react, and you can actually like swim over these and move it, and they'll like suck in, which is really cool. They come in all sorts of crazy colors. They're just a beautiful array of amazingness. I don't know. I don't know how else to say it. They're just really cool. And they filter feed, so they help kind of with one of the things about filter feeding, they grab all that particular organic matter and they help recycle the nutrients back into the water cycle, which is really important because not everything can eat particular organic matter, but they can eat these little horseshoe worms. So a lot, not crabs, worms, very important, different. Horseshoe crabs are a thing we'll talk about later. So, yeah, they're just neat. And they help with kind of nutrient processing in the ocean, as do all filter feeders. So pretty important, because you might be like, I'm not going to eat a horseshoe worm. Why do I care? Because if you look at the food chain, something you eat probably eats horseshoe worms or eat something that eats horseshoe worms. And without them, you wouldn't be able to eat your delicious tuna or mackerel or sardines or whatever other things you eat from the ocean. And you might be like, I don't eat things from the ocean. Cool. Other people do. And so if they're eating things from the ocean, they're not going to take your food. And when we think about food scarcity, that's important. Then you have the phylum Mollusca. These are our mollusks. Now, a lot of times, if you're familiar with the term mollusk, you probably think about things like this. These are the mollusks that you eat. And you're like, yeah, I know a mollusk. But the phylum Mollusca is much bigger than that. It's the second most diverse phylum in Kingdom Animalia. The first being Arthropoda, which we'll talk about in the next lecture because it's so diverse. It's going to take up a chunk of the next lecture. But phylum Mollusca doesn't just have these little shell things. It also has octopus, and it has snails, and it has all sorts of crazy things. So how do you decide what's a mollusk? A couple of things. It has a visceral mass. Wow, what does that mean? It just means like a body, kind of like a fleshy area that has a bunch of cells. Like it's just a body. That's really it. Then it has a foot. And so here, the squid, yes, a squid's a mollusk. You can see it's got these tentacles. Those count as feet. But even this clam here, this is a foot. That's how they move across sand, or like you might see them bury themselves in the sand. That's how. And then they also have a mantle, which is like a head region that usually has holes or has like an empty space. So it's got a body, a foot, and a head. Even if it's not, this squid has a cephalized head. Clams, not so much exactly. Some do actually, but this isn't so much. But still, there's like an area in here that's got like an empty space, and that's the mantle. I know some of these names are kind of weird. That's what kind of makes mollusks. But if we talk more about what a mollusk is, you have your bivalves. So these are the things, like I said, if you eat scallops, if you eat oysters, if you eat mollusks, those are all bivalves. They are organisms with a visceral mass. Look at that. Delicious. And two shells on either side. The bi comes from two. So it's got two shells clumped together. Oysters, yes, they do make pearls. All of that, that's completely true. It's an irritation, and it's kind of, you can imagine if you sat there with a piece of sand in your mouth, because the fleshy visceral mass of an oyster is like a mouth. It's wet, it's soft. It would be really irritating. So this is kind of an immune response. Really, the pearl is really an immune response. Be like, oh, gosh, you're annoying me. So I'm gonna put this like soft, beautiful layers of things on it, so you're not annoying me anymore. Humans happen to think it's pretty, and that's how we have pearls. Or that's not how we have pearls. We'd have pearls anyway, but that's why people wear pearls. It's really just like wearing oyster saliva, honestly. But it's pretty oyster saliva, so it's fine. You can see here, the reason I chose this beautiful clam here is bivalves are almost exclusively filter feeders. So they have all these little filaments that go out into the water, filter feed. They can usually close their shells. And that's because this visceral mass, delicious, and there's nothing like really to protect them. So they have these hard shells to protect them, When something's like, I want to eat that visceral mass, they close up, and they're usually pretty hard to open. Which is why when organisms can open it, like sea stars or sea otters, it's like noteworthy. So bivalves, two shells, visceral mass inside. All sorts of things. Some are sessile, like oysters, they don't move. Others do move, like clams. If you've ever been to the ocean and you'll see it wash up onto shore and then it washes away, and you see these little clams that then kind of go vertical and bury themselves. Those are more motile. So this can be both sessile or motile, depending on which species you're talking about. Then you have your cephalopods. Cephalopods means head foot. Yeah, I know. I didn't name that. These are incredibly intelligent creatures. We have our squid, you have your octopus, and you have your cuttlefish. They are masters of disguise. They have what's called chromatophore, which are just cells that are literally made to change color. If you look at this beautiful squid, all of these black dots are chromatophores. And it helps it blend into the environment. If this was like sitting up against a stark environment right here, like instead of just kind of swimming, the chromatophores would fire a lot more and it would turn like black and be really hard to see. Octopi, oh wow, they're incredible at what do you call it? At camouflage. They're also, both octopi and squid, incredibly smart. They have crazy social structures. There's literally a relatively recent paper. And it was I think it was in Australia. I'm not sure though. It was in an area where they had a lot of octopi. And they noticed that female octopus were literally throwing shells at males. And they were like, what is this? Is this like a courtship thing? What is it? Turns out they were just like annoyed. Literally, when the males would come around, the females would start throwing rocks at them and shells until the males left. And they'd get distressed, and then the females would just be like, cool, no more males. Yeah, if they found somebody annoying, they'd throw things at them. How amazing. Credible social structures, really cool reproduction. What happens for octopi is males will have the like sperm packet in their arm. Because yes, these are arms. They have 8 of them. And they'll be like, okay, hey, pretty lady, I've got some sperm for you. And what they'll do is they'll cut off their arm and give it to the female. It's like, here, take it. Take all the sperm with you. They can regrow their arms. They regenerate. Really cool. Some of them do, some of them don't, depending on what time it is. They also, and the female's like, great, takes it, eats it, because, you know, like making babies is hard. It has thousands of little, they kind of just look like little grains of rice almost, but they have octopi growing inside of them, thanks to the sperm from the male. And they sit there and they guard it, and they guard it with such ferocity that they stop eating and they die. Yeah, incredible story. Great mothers. Octopus even have handedness, meaning of their 8 arms, they do have to have a favorite. It's like, hey, I like this one the best. Thank you so much. And they'll use that the most for doing certain things. Yeah, octopi are really cool. And so are squid. They're very cool as well. Squid move a lot more, so they're a lot harder to keep in captivity, which also means they're a lot harder not just to like see in a what do you call it, in an aquarium, but also a lot harder to study, because if things move, they're harder to study. Octopi, as you may know, they live in aquaria, but they don't do super well. They usually die within a couple of years. But to be fair, cephalopods have a really short lifespan. They only live a few, about 5-ish years in the wild anyway, which is really sad. They also have these crazy pupils that are like lines, kind of like goats. Crazy little line pupils, but they have really great eyesight. If you've ever heard of a giant squid, it's real. They actually take on whales. They have these crazy long arms and tentacles that they'll try to eat what do you call it? A whale, or maybe not eat them, but really protect themselves, because those whales will try to eat them. And they eat fish and all sorts of crazy things because they have what's called a beak. And just like a bird beak, it's 2 keratinized things that like crazy looking, really scary. And they eat usually meat like fish and things. These tentacles are super sucky, or these arms are super sucky. They're just really cool creatures. Um, like I said, by pretty much every metric we can find, they're incredibly intelligent. Some would argue that they'd rule the world if they weren't so short-lived. I don't know that I'd argue that, but I've heard that argument made before. So there you go. I'm just giving it to you. Cephalopods, amazing. Just really intelligent creatures. And then we have your gastropods. Gastropod means stomach foot, and they're incredible. Absolutely incredible. The first kind we're going to talk about are nudibranchs. These are sea slugs. They are beautiful. I'm going to just like give you a moment of silence to look at these. Are you appreciating? Are you enjoying? So cool. Look, this one has cute little antennae, little feather antennae, also little feather butt. Yes, do you know why? Filter feeding, and they also usually eat things kind of off the ground, whatever they find, a little nastiness. But they filter feed as well, little butt filter feeding for you. Who doesn't want some of that? Look at this. Looks like a Pokemon, actually a nudibranch, a sea slug, a real life creature. On this little cutie baby. They have crazy array of colors and shapes and sizes. They can be huge, they can be small. They're beautiful. They're incredible. They usually live on the bottom of the ocean, kind of eat the nasty things, kind of help with nutrient cycling again, eat poop and things, delicious. Kind of decomposers of the ocean in a lot of ways. This little guy can swim, but still eats kind of decomposing things, but still very important and beautiful. Literally, you could just like, I don't know, spend hours and hours just looking at nudibranchs. I don't know, maybe you couldn't, but I could. They're so cute and so beautiful and so cool and really diverse. Because remember, they're mollusks, just like bivalves and cephalopods. And so that makes them the second part of the second most diverse group. Another gastropod are conchs. Look at it. This is a queen conch. Look at its little eyeballs. Isn't that cute? Yeah. Here in America, we don't eat a lot of conch, but in other countries, they definitely do, especially like in the Caribbean countries. It's pretty good. It's a little chewy, but it's pretty good. And look at these. These also are just little creatures that they do move around. They make these shells. They don't like find them like hermit crabs. You know, hermit crabs can't make their own shell. They're these little nasty grocers. And they kind of have to find shells. No, the conchs make their shells, and then when they die, other things can live in it, which is cool. They're beautiful, super and crazy complex in here. And this is a horse conch. Yes, it is named that because it looks like a horse phallus. Which, you know, there you go. That's why they named it that. But it's another species of conch, so not all of them are beautiful. Some of them have this, which is called an operculum, which really just protects it, but some of them don't. It just depends on the conch. Conch or conch, both are accepted depending on where you live. They're so cool, and they're gastropods. Then you have snails. Snails can live on the land or on the sea. There's both aquatic and terrestrial snails, but they all need to live in kind of a damp environment. That's why you usually find them kind of either, you know, in the water, it's always damp, but like in mossy areas, under logs, things like that. If it's raining, a lot of snails come out because they have this skin, some of which can go into the snail shell, but not all of it usually. It's really prone to drying out. They don't want to dry out, so they live in areas where it's pretty moist. Have you seen, they were kind of popular on TikTok, but they lost popularity, but there's giant land snails that are like this big. They're cool. Don't get one. They're incredibly invasive and completely ruin the ecosystem if released. Yeah, we're going to talk about invasive species well later in the semester at the very end. But pretty much it's when humans are like, I left these species here, either by accident and sometimes on purpose. Or people are like, you know, I got the snake. I don't want it anymore. I'll just release it into the environment. And it's the more humane thing to do. No, it's not, because it can ruin the whole environment. That's why you have super snakes in Florida. Yeah. So, don't get a giant African land snail, even though they're cool. These again are decomposers. Pretty much all the gastropods decomposers. So, you know, you're not surrounded by poop and dead things. You can thank gastropods. Now, just a reminder, gastropods, cephalopods, bivalves, all mollusks. Okay, all in the phylum Mollusca. They're just 3 different groups within that phylum. And the last phylum we're going to talk about today are brachiopods. These look a lot like our bivalves. Technically, they're not, though. They do still filter feed. You can see this, but what makes them different is that symmetry. They're bilaterally symmetrical, but bivalves are bilaterally symmetrical at the hinge. So if you were to open them up, they'd be the same on either side. Brachiopods are not. They're bilaterally symmetrical across the top. Obviously, if you close this and cut it in half, it's not the same on either side. But here it is. But when we talk about like its role in the environment, what does it do? It does pretty much the same thing. But they're technically different phylums, so I'm going to introduce them to you as different phylum, even though depending on what you care about, they do the same thing. So that's part 1 of inverts. Amazing, beautiful, crazy. We love them all. I assume that you are now just have such a greater appreciation for inverts, and I hope you love them. Then we'll talk about some more in the next lecture.